On today's episode of Hungry for Wisdom, if at first you don't succeed, burn it to the ground and blame the guy holding the fire hose. We will interview a professional punching bag, and if everything you touch turns to crap, how about you don't touch my kid's education? It's episode 86. Turn it up! We're going to get right down to business today. Episode 86 is dedicated to Christians working in public school systems, things like that. I know you guys have a lot of ethical conundrums or conundra. I don't know the plural for that because the particular public school district where I was educated was not interested in specifying such things for us. But all of the various problems and tricky situations you guys come up against. We pray for you. We love you. And I really hope that people listen to you because you got the gospel and the world desperately needs the gospel. So keep doing what you're doing and go and swoop up one soul at a time here and there. And I know it's hard slugging, man, but I'm thankful that you guys are in the fight. So let me read something out of Proverbs. Let's get it. Proverbs 31 verses 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. All right, so we're talking to somebody today that, we kind of joked in previous episodes about you, about I wonder if we have one of those FBI voice alteration things. Unfortunately, I'm a cheapskate, and we don't have any of that cool equipment. So, but I am just, kind of be vague about whatever your name. And that's really on my side. It's, it's not like you came in here with a hood over your face or whatever, but, we're going to be talking about some stuff that is public policy and people made these decisions and you work inside this system. So, with that non-introduction, it's good to have you here, buddy. And I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, why don't you give us a quick rundown of just kind of the place that you occupy in the public school system. And then I'll kind of talk about what led up to this conversation, basically. What's your job?
Currently I'm serving the role of an administrator within the public school system at a local school. So I support probably around about 600 students.
Okay. Yeah. So what led to this was you and I were talking in just over a meal, and you were kind of giving your perspective on some things that there's a lot of speculation about in the world, right? So it's like, oh man, the school system says this, and the news is saying that, and I'm hearing this, and so on. But you're on the front lines of this stuff, and so your perspective was better informed, and I think a lot more helpful than somebody like me who's getting all of this secondhand. And I'm like, hey man, people need to know this stuff, and specifically, and we're going to get into this later, but specifically about some of the effects, the mental and psychological effects that some of the COVID response and the shutdowns had on our kids, right?
Oh,
and so, so I'm just interested in people kind of hearing your perspective on this kind of stuff. First off, background information. You're in the public school system now in Washington State. Have you seen the public school system in other states as well? Is all your experience here? Are you able to compare apples to apples? What's some of your background in that?
I have subbed in, when I've lived in other states, I've subbed in the school districts there. I teach for a university in another state in their school of education as well at a Christian university. But then most of my time has actually been in this school district. And so this is kind of here in Washington.
Yeah. So this is all your familiarity as far as the ins and the outs of it and things like that. Yeah. And I bring that up because I wonder sometimes how federal the education system is. I know we have a federal Department of Education, but I don't know how broken out it is as far as how much autonomy do state education systems have in terms of what they prescribe and implement and things like that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of autonomy in the sense that, money talks, right? And so a large part of funding for the public school system comes from the federal government. Even though you look at it, it's a small, quote unquote, percentage, but it controls a lot. And so there are things that have to be checked off, things that have to be done in order for those allocations to be received. So it really does carry a lot of weight, the influence.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then a Washington State school district or a school district in Washington State might, it's pretty common, I would guess, to say, hey, we want to do this, but you can't because there's some federal thing that you're butting up against. So that's just a tension that's in all Probably
in order,
public systems.
in order to do this, you have to in order to receive that money, all these things have to be done. And so there is the possibility if I do this, I miss out on this type of funding.
Okay. And that funding, I'm guessing, is essential to the operations of the school.
It is. I mean, and I think I misspoke a moment ago. I mean, the large majority of funding comes from the state, but the money from the federal government is extremely impacting.
Yeah.
And so a lot of school districts would not be able to do the things that they do provide for students if it was not for the money they were receiving federally.
So it's not really viable for a district to tell the federal government to just take a hike in general.
Not really.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's some of that interplay, right? There's always some of that. I mean, stuff costs money, right? So then you are in a position of administration and you're a solid Christian. All right. Now I say solid, and that is my assessment. That's not, just so the listeners know, that's not his self-assessment coming in here. I know you. I've done a little bit of ministry with you now, not a whole lot, but enough to see like, okay, dude knows what he believes and he's living accordingly. Now, what we're seeing here, and these are again not your words, these are mine. What we're seeing in the Washington State public school system is very anti-Christian in its thrust as far as a lot of the new stuff that's getting the attention, right? And so I would imagine that there's a lot of ideological clashes that you end up having with the new policies or maybe curricula or something like that you're supposed to be implementing. It looks, from my perspective, like that would be a regular experience for you at this point. Is that, am I reading that right, or is it not as bad as all that?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the building, the makeup of the community in which the school resides. And so if you have a school that is in more of a little bit conservative area, even within the same district, the families and the involvement of the families, that speaks, that does a lot. So there are things that are more prevalent in some schools than others. So like in the school that I'm in, there are definitely some things. So like the sex ed education and the push that way is not as prevalent as if you were to go to the local high school and what they're pushing. And maybe some of the more urban schools, they're going to have a different response to some of the curriculum and the diversity, equity, inclusion push than you would from some of the schools that are more in a conservative area. Okay.
Can you define that DEI thing?
Diversity, equity, inclusion. So that's really talking more about gender equality, looking at teaching students that they can pretty much, choose their gender, allowing guys to use girls' bathrooms and vice versa, and allow them to, that gender choice kind of process.
Okay. So there's like a set of, help me phrase this correctly. Yeah. So there's a set of policies or sources of curriculum or something that is designed to push this kind of gender neutrality or fluidity stuff, and they call that package of ideas or that program diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so there's a lot of guidance that's coming from the state. It's not clearly mapped out, at least within our district. It's not as clearly mapped out how that is being pushed through. So there are a lot of things kind of in flux right now with that, but you definitely see some things that are trickling down.
Okay. So how does that look? You're held to certain standards of, meeting certain quotas of implementation or something?
So the teachers have to receive certain trainings. And so it's very much pushed on them through state mandated trainings in order to be able to start the school year. So it's embedded in their safe schools trainings.
Okay.
So they get it that way, a lot of it that way.
Is it true? I ask this, because this is a rumor that's out there. This is a rumor in conservative media. Now, I'm a pretty conservative leaning dude, but unfortunately, I've got trust issues with conservative media in addition to the rest. So I got to double check this stuff, right? People are people. Is it true that in Washington State we're putting litter boxes in classrooms? In bathrooms,
I have not seen that at all.
Okay.
I have never seen that or heard of that happening.
All right. Okay. I heard that was happening and I was like, you know what? I got just a guy to ask about that. So, but if something like that were to happen, we talk about, choosing bathrooms, if a boy wants to go in a girl's bathroom, then, hey, who are we to decide what gender he identifies as and things like that. That kind of methodology for dealing with things is what's included in that DEI training.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So how off the wall has it gotten in your experience? Have you seen stuff get really bad or a push for stuff getting really bad?
No, actually, in my building alone that I work in, there isn't a huge push that way. So, we've had a couple students that have had some leanings and we've had to have some conversations, but it's been, and it even goes back to kind of the requirements of the protections that are put in place. So with the guidance that we're receiving, students own their identity. So we are not, parents have to get permission to give their child Tylenol. Kids can't even carry cough drops in school without parental consent, but they can choose their gender, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so I do have some students that we've had to have those conversations and kind of gauge, how much do the parents know? When do the parents get brought into that conversation? Students want to be called by a certain name. I have found different ways around that. I just refer to the student as the student or by the student's last name. And so then I do that for all of my students instead of just those, because then that's another way that could be pointed out that I'm not doing something correctly. So there are different workarounds with it, but I have had some students that we've had to make accommodations for them to, well, instead of going into the girls' locker room, what about a staff restroom? You can dress down there for PE, or you can use that. And a lot of times what I'm seeing, at least within the student population that I'm working with, they haven't really made a determination really and truly, like, okay, I'm going to identify as a male, I'm going to identify as a female. Like they may say, okay, they're biologically one gender choosing to be another, but they haven't even gauged the conversation of pronouns or names.
Okay.
And so it's very much, they're lost. They're lost with, and in many ways, but they're lost with the direction of where to go, and they're seeking help and guidance.
And you said it's different in the high schools, and so maybe
it's much more prevalent in the high schools.
Maybe they've had some more time to kind of wrap their heads around what identity they want to put forward and things like that. I mean, if you're dealing with a younger age group, it seems reasonable that maybe they wouldn't have it all they wouldn't be able to verbalize it at a younger age, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you're having to find workarounds. I don't know if that was the word you used. You're having to find workarounds for how to navigate this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That seems like a collision course at some point. So are you just like, are you like, is there a sword hanging over the back of your neck as far as your employment? Like what kind of pressure does that bring? If you screw this up, is it like, boom, you're out of there? Or is it a slap on the wrist and everybody kind of understands this is an impossible situation to navigate? Or, I mean, what kind of pressure are you actually under in your day-to-day livelihood?
At the moment, I'm not under a ton of pressure because my workarounds, they're working. And I have some administrators that are supportive of that. So where it's going to get sticky is like, an official documentation and how we refer to students. Because there are students that have used that as a way to tell their parents, this is the decision that I've made. And so without student consent, we cannot give parents any of that information.
You can't tell parents things without the student consenting to you telling the parents. Because,
they, according to state law, they own their identity.
Is it true that that's also the case of like medical stuff with the school nurse? Like they could like a school nurse can provide treatment to whatever degree they can anyway without informing the parents
at a certain age. And I could be off by a year or two, but like, for example, like even when you go to the local doctor, I think 12 or 13 at that point, unless the child gives consent for the parent to know their medical information, doctors' offices can't even release that information to parents.
Really?
Yeah.
That young?
Mm-hmm. And so it's the same way in schools. Like, so there are conversations that the student can have with the nurse. Now, the nurse can never administer medication without a doctor's note, parental consent. But as far as conversations, reproductive health or anything like that, those conversations are privileged, and the parents are not notified without student giving consent.
So a 13-year-old can have a conversation with a school nurse about reproductive health and receive guidance, and the parents know nothing about it.
Yes.
Unless the student decides to tell their parents.
And they can talk to guidance counselors, get the same information. Guidance counselors can connect them with community resources, and the parents are never notified.
Wow. That's evil. All right. So it looks to me like, now I maybe have a slight reputation for stating things in a bombastic manner, okay? Not inaccurate, mind you, because I don't say things until I think they're actually true, but it looks to me like the public school system is intentionally just sort of like committing suicide, right? Like there's ideological things happening that are non-sustainable and manifestly and demonstrably harmful to the students, and they keep pushing ahead with it. Do you agree with my read on that? Because you got more information than I do.
Yes, but to a degree. I think what we do need to separate is the system from the people.
Okay.
So you have a public school system. It's made up of people, but not everyone agrees with the direction it's going in. But however, one thing that can't really be disputed is that the majority of the people that within the system, I mean, this is their livelihood. There's nothing else for them to turn to, nothing else for them to do. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, whether they have a Christian belief system or not. I know people within the system that do not have a faith, but are morally against what is happening. And so I think there's a distinction that needs to be made there, but it's kind of like, what we see in government anyway. We have a bunch of people in government making decisions about things they really know nothing about. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of times in many ways, that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And then things get messy because there's other money involved and there's constituencies and there's, all the stuff that people normally rant about. It's a special interest groups and whatever. But honestly, there are factors beyond just the well-being of the child in terms of what policies get made. And
if teachers don't comply, then it's a mark against their license. If they refuse to take part, I have a colleague in another district who actually resigned his position because their annual training included something that he was not comfortable participating in.
For the sake of conscience.
Yeah, for the sake of conscience, he couldn't do it. Luckily for him, his district allowed him out of his contract. But after a certain point, you say, when this training is available, it's after the cutoff date typically within the contract where you can resign without penalty. And so some districts could really stick it to you and say, no, it's after this date. You do this or you quit. You quit. We report it to the state. You have a mark on your license and you have to report that anywhere else that you try to transfer your license, it's going to follow you. You try to apply to another district, they can blacklist you for up to a year or two from ever applying in another district.
So it seems to me like if you're because we're in a relatively conservative area. I say relatively because in Washington, these things are graded on a curve, right? But it seems like maybe you could catch some breaks or keep your head basically below the radar in a relatively conservative area. But if you're over in, inner city Seattle or, some of the places where there's just less patience for ideological variation on these things, then, would you be able to survive in your position in a more liberal area, do you think?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I don't believe so. In fact, that's one of the reasons I would be nervous at even leaving the district that I'm in, is I'm not certain that I could continue doing what I do in another district.
So that's that disconnect you're talking about between the people. Like it's working for you because you're around people where there's who share there's a certain overlap of concerns and views on these things, and so there's kind of strength in numbers, I guess, just in terms of being able to carry it out for a while. Is that sustainable, or is it all just going to get forced through at some point? Bust out your crystal ball here.
I'm not convinced that I'm going to be able to retire in my current field.
Yeah.
I don't know how long it's going to last.
Okay. So you're staying in there. Why?
God hasn't opened a door for me to go anywhere else. And I do think that it's important to have, strong believers within the system.
So I've made a kind of an offhanded comment before, certainly not a pastoral prescription or anything, but like, what if, so I'm a homeschool dad, right? And I'm a homeschool dad for, me and my wife, we got our own reasons for that. I don't need to rehearse them all here. But ideologically, that's what we want to be doing. Okay. So I've made this statement like, boy, could we get all the Christian kids out of the school system and then rush all the Christian adults in that are teachers and administrators and things like that? Because there is this disconnect, right? And there's this ability, at least in some situations, to make some kind of an impact and have a voice in there. I don't really have much of a voice. I can go to school board meetings like anybody can, but from inside the system, I don't have much of a voice. But the more Christians there are, it seems like the more benefit there would be for a busted up system anyway. Would you agree with that? Or do you think, I'm talking to somebody who's inside of it, right? Let's run a scenario. Let's say there's a Christian college student who's going to school to be an educator, right? Would you encourage them to rush in and just say, yeah, man, we need more Christians there working there? Or would you encourage them to not run into a burning building?
No, look at it this way. If you have a teaching credential, you can teach in a public institution, you can teach in a private institution, you can teach in a faith-based institution. So I would never deter anyone from seeking the education to be able to do that. One of the things that I do want to point out, you're right. Like we need believers in the system or nothing's going to change. It's just going to get worse. Not every family, I applaud any family that's able to have the means to homeschool their kids, especially in a society that's not designed to operate within a single income household. But not every family has that opportunity. And so because of that, and considering that, we need as many believers within the system as possible, just to stand for truth, but also like these students that are confused. I mean, really and truly, it comes back to they're confused. They need compassion. They need guidance, and they don't need to be beaten over the head with anything, but
Sure.
they need guidance.
Well, yeah, and they're confused because they've been lied to by adults, and so the solution to that is for adults to tell them the truth, right? Ephesians 4:15, man, speak the truth in love. So then, as an individual and a citizen, and I won't reveal whether or not you're a father, but let's just run a scenario and say you've got kids. Is it time, in your opinion, not speaking for the school district or whatever, if somebody can get their kids out of the public school system and homeschool them, you think it's time to do that? Or would you encourage Christian parents to give it a shot, leave them? And I ask you this. I'm sorry, let me back up. I ask you this because, from my perspective where I'm at, I'm like, man, if the thing wants to burn itself to the ground, like there's a certain point to just like let it, like, and it's sad, and it's not anything you say with great joy, but I'm really pushing back against that idea that, which is a very common thing to hear. And some of our listeners, I'm sure, have said things like this, where it's like, well, my kid needs to be there to be a witness. And, if you take all the kids out of the school system, then who's going to be the light? And I'm just like,
I don't buy into that at all. I mean, I even had a conversation with someone. It's like, okay, so, well, I do have a kid, and my kid wants to, if my kid wants to be a fireman, on day one, is he going into a 4-alarm fire, or does he have to go through the academy and learn and grow to learn the skills to be able to combat that fire? I'm not going to throw him in a fire. I think that's the same way when it comes to the school system. Like I'm not going to ever use that excuse or that rationale that my kid needs to be a witness. They need to be prepared to be that witness. That preparation happens at home. It's not going to happen in the school system that gets your children for 7 hours a day. It's your responsibility. And so there are families that have no choice but to put their kids in school system, whether it's in the public school or a private school. But I think, I'm not even saying that private Christian schools or private school is the answer. What we need to make sure that we're not doing is abdicating our responsibility to raise up and train up our children.
Yeah, that's why I cracked that joke at the beginning about, it was about the government, obviously, right? If you suck at everything that you do, then stop doing my kid's education, right? Yeah. Because you're going to screw it up. And I don't know, man, I'm split on this because, like, on one hand, is the idea of public education just flawed in general and kind of doomed towards this because the parents are giving something away? Or is it redeemable? It has been done well, like Thomas Jefferson was a big advocate for it. And when you read his reasons for it, it's like, oh, that's great. That I agree with him. Karl Marx was a big advocate for it. And when you read his reasons for it, it's like, wow, that's about the most satanic thing I've ever heard in my life. And so is it just poison root, poison fruit eventually? Or is this, I mean, I'm getting a little philosophical on you here, but do you think it's like, do you think that the idea of public education is just misguided, or have we just taken it to a wrong place and it could be brought back?
I think it could be brought back. I think we've lost the core of what's the purpose of education anyway. Like, it originally was to teach students to read, write, do math, those type, learn history, those types of things. We've gone away from that in a big way, and we've slowly abdicated our responsibility and allowed the government to assume a role that was never theirs to begin with. And I think even early founders of education would even agree with that. When you look at the different philosophies of education, we've strayed away from the original purpose.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to not hedge. I want to give some background to this question. It seems like, from my perspective, there's an intentional thrust of activating children sexually and that's the thrust of a lot of the, I don't know if curriculum if it's that narrow, but just a lot of the policies that are going in place. We've done a segment on this show recently. We call it Just So You Know, and we just read out legislation that opens the doors to pedophilia not being punished, and then who's supporting this legislation and things like that. And so it's like, it seems obvious to me, like, if it quacks and waddles, it's probably a duck. And when you got pedophiles making law, I don't know what's going on in their personal life, but this is the effect that this is going to have, and it seems intentional. And so it looks to me like the design, just because the outcome is known of this stuff, so the design must be to sexualize our kids, right? But I'm looking at this from the outside. Does it look that way from the inside, that like the curriculum to discuss sexual issues and issues of even gender, and then sexual engagement and how things feel and all that kind of stuff happening on at such a young age. It looks intentional, like grooming, and so we use that word a lot. Would you use that word? Are we reading this right? What do you think?
So I'm not sure that the curriculum has caught up with a lot of the initiatives that are being pushed out. So the curriculum that I have seen, and systems, they go through an adoption every several years. And so this is a more quote unquote recent push. And so I definitely foresee there being some changes with the next curriculum adoptions that districts go through. But I haven't seen that within the curriculum. Now, it still does talk about same-sex attraction and things like that, but not to the degree that we are seeing elsewhere in our nation, what's being pushed in the classroom.
Okay. So then where does this go over the next 30 years? Well, okay, no, we'll get back to that after this. Rather than just talking about the sexualization of children in general and where that goes over the next 30 years, let's back up to the response to COVID. All right. So I'm shifting gears here. COVID-19 hits. The response was what it was. I don't need to rehash the whole thing. There's a lot of isolation. There's a lot of, shelter in place, stay home, da-da-da-da-da. Now, it's not even debatable. At the time, there were a bunch of people screaming like, this is not healthy. The cure is worse than the disease, right? But now it's indisputable. You can go and track that and look at abuse rates and unplanned pregnancies and addictions and overdoses. I mean, I'm a pastor. I'm the one doing the funerals, right? So this is all well known at this point. What's not well known is the psychological effects that this has especially on kids, because that takes maybe decades to track. But you're starting to see a lot of this now.
Absolutely.
And you happen to be uniquely qualified just in terms of your studies and your experience and everything to comment on this. So let me get you talking about the psychological and then the practical effects of kids, let's say up through middle school, well, high school now, because it's been a few years, right? So up through high school graduation, what are we seeing now as far as mental health challenges that we weren't seeing in mass before?
Oh, good. Where do you begin?
Yeah, just a small question for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've seen just a huge increase in suicide ideations, depression, anxiety. I mean, we have students, and we've got data to show where we've got students who were straight A students, socially active and involved, who now won't even enter the doors of a school because of the fear that was imparted on them when it came to COVID and the isolation that took place. So we have a higher number of students now that are being moved to online learning, or a higher truancy rate because they're not even showing up to school. Students who had perfect attendance that now aren't even showing up. We saw just a huge attitude shift as well within our students where, COVID shut everything down, but parents still had to work. And so parents had, by no choice of their own, they had to work and provide for their families, leaving their kids at home. So then we had kids whose parental responsibilities were abdicated on them. They became the kind of the caregivers and providers for their younger siblings, responsible for getting their kids ready, their siblings ready for school, get them on the computer, doing those types of things, therefore sacrificing even their own education because the bandwidth for the internet couldn't even sustain having all the siblings on the computer at the same time doing their schooling.
So the older ones let the younger ones, they become the parent.
Mm-hmm. And so then schools opened back up, and now all of a sudden you went from making us be adults to now you're treating us like kids again with the rules and structures and everything. And so there was just this mass rebellion.
Right. Well, it's like at that point, I could see a case to be made for like, hey, I've raised myself for a couple of years.
Exactly.
I don't need you.
Yeah. And then you also then see the maturity level of like our middle school students who are on average 2 to 3 years behind when it comes to just social awareness. Just the immaturity rate is so high right now. Kids come into school with stuffed animals and blankets and things like that, just scared out of their mind.
You had made a comment, and I don't want to misquote you. It was in our private conversation. You made a comment about seeing the signs of autism in kids that were not actually autistic, just the inability to pick up on social cues or something like that.
Yes.
What are we seeing there?
So, there are a lot more students that are unable to really process and kind of even regulate. And so social cues are not picking up on body language, tones, what's acceptable and unacceptable communication and behavior. They're not picking up on. They're just their social and awareness is very reduced.
I had read one study that, I don't know if it was a study, it was a report, it was some journalism, about masks having hampered kids in certain years of certain developmental years, just not seeing a lot of people's faces. They were unable to read, you mentioned body language, but to read facial cues, and all that nonverbal communication was largely lost on them because they couldn't see people's faces when they needed to.
Absolutely. During just prime developmental years and milestones that were missed. In fact, there was a story that was relayed to me from Spokane where we had twins that were in the hospital. One had to stay significantly longer than another, but because it was during COVID, everyone was masked up when the parents weren't in the room, which they had to be. The child wasn't brought to their room. They had to go to where the child was. So by default, they were masked. Actually, these kids were actually turned over to the state for other reasons. And so like doctors were masked, everyone was. And so when you now compare these two, the development of these siblings, no developmental delays prior to this, everything was kind of going along well. Now there's significant delays.
All right. Well, not to cut that off. What else? I mean, so we've got social cues being missed. We've got issues of kind of, developmental leapfrog going on where kids are missing their childhood, being treated like adults or being forced to act like adults and then going back to being treated like kids again. What any other problems that you're suffering for on a daily basis now, just interacting with kids whose development has been skewed?
Well, it's also been prime time for gang recruitment. You've got families that are gone because, again, they're working, they're providing for their families. And you've got kids that were left home alone, isolated. They wanted community, they wanted friends. Prime time for gang recruitment. And we've seen an increase in that all across the state.
Which, of course, is going to lead to an increase in crime, drugs, human trafficking.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when we've had Tricia McFarland on the show, who's the director for Mirror Ministries, and they rescue girls from trafficking situations and boys too, from trafficking situations and things like that. And I asked her one time, a long time ago, when I was first getting to know her, I said, who are all these pimps? Like, who's rolling into the Tri-Cities and staying under the radar such that we never see them? And she was like, it's not like that. It's their cousins and it's their brothers and their boyfriends that they've known since they were little. And it's like people in the neighborhood that end up getting the girls into these relationships where they have power over them in some form, and then they pimp them out, and it's that kind of thing. And so then when the isolation happens and you lock all these people in with their abusers, then, they're not following social distancing restrictions. They're going from house to house doing whatever. So you wind up with a whole mess on your hands. So then with that, then there's my question. Where does that go in 30 years? Because you never get a second chance at childhood development, right? So if you've got a kid who's not interacting in a healthy way, and 30 years from now they're going to start running our cities and our states and our country, do we have a way of tracing out what that damage looks like? Because it's going to be global, whatever it is.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. It's scary to think about. My wife and I have talked about that. Like it's a real scary thing to see what's going to happen.
One thing that I have seen that the public schools are still needed for in some family situations is special needs kids. There's programs in place in public schools for educating special needs kids.
Absolutely.
Right? When you think about some reactive attachment disorders and things like that it's like parents really just need help. Like, what do I do with my kid? And they're willing to do anything, but it really does take some expertise to kind of communicate math to them and things like that. And so they've got their kids in the public school system for that reason. Kids are our most vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. And the special needs kids are the most vulnerable of that crowd. Yeah. And so have those systems been polluted by DEI stuff to the point where parents need to get their kids out of there, or is there still good work to be done there?
I'm not seeing that happen. Really and truly, when we're talking about the most severe of students that are disabled, that are more like in like all day self-containment type programs because of the severity of their needs, it really is teaching basics of reading, writing, math. They'll learn science experiments, things that are instructionally appropriate for them, and then looking more like adaptive living, social skills, interacting with one another. I haven't seen any of the DEI push in any way within the curriculum or anything like that. Because, and I think the world of special education is a little protected with that right now, because when you're looking at special education, you're looking at specific skill deficits and how do we address those to either, well, really to build a bridge between what they're lacking and where we want them to be. So it's not really that DEI push in that area.
So how do we help kids that have been affected, not special needs kids, but the kids that would otherwise be on a normal track of education that have been affected like this, and they are now socially, if not academically, developmentally delayed because of the structures and the response to COVID and all this kind of stuff? Where do you go? How do you start helping them?
Honestly, I mean, mentorship. What I wish that we had more in the Tri-Cities was more mentor programs, because we do have parents that are like, I don't know what to do. My kids are doing this and I don't know how to help them. We've tried this, we've tried that, but really and truly just mentorship, where finding mutual interest that this kid has. Like if I have a kid who wants to learn guitar and I have someone who would love to teach someone, and just doing life together that way and have that commitment, I think we'd start to see more of a turnaround. But we need positive investment into those kids.
I just hear the word community,
yeah.
Right? This is like the basic function of community.
Yeah.
Man, it's like, this drives me crazy, dude, because it's like the most important thing for our overall health is the one thing that we denied everybody. And look, I understood at the beginning of the whole like shutdown thing, like nobody's seen this before, we got to figure all this out. I am not a fan of a lot of our leaders in this state. And I was even giving them grace. I'm thinking like they're working with higher quality information than we've got. And, leadership is tough, right? So I get that. But like by the time this stuff comes out and that response had lasted so long, and you've got every expert with a spine in the world just saying like, guys, this is gonna hurt. And they just pushed forward with it. It's like, oh my gosh, guys, like how this is insane. And it's evil, by the way. And the one thing so rant almost concluded here. The one thing that we were all saying is people need people, right? We're designed to be communal beings. You can't cut that off for a long time and expect it not to kill people. And it is, man. And not all ways of dying are, death is not the worst option in some situations, right? There are things that are worse than death. And a lifetime of an inability to connect with humans might be on that list.
Yeah. Well, and since COVID, we have a point within our mental health system where they can't even sustain the need.
Yeah,
there are not enough crisis counselors to support the needs that we're having of people of all ages.
Yeah, and then from our perspective, like let alone Christian professionals that I would be willing to refer out to that aren't gonna come at them from a secular worldview, because that can. I mean, I don't know. There's good professionals out there, but it's like we want to refer to Christians who understand what an image of God actually is and what the soul is created of and things like that. And I mean, as far as especially in an isolated community like the Tri-Cities. I mean, forget it. They're maxed out. There are some good dudes out there, but good luck, right?
Yeah.
All right. So then for adults that are employed in the public school system here, what's your encouragement, your coaching to them? What you say, all right, guys, get up. You're going to go to work tomorrow. Here's what I want you to have in mind, right? What would you tell them?
I mean, it's not easy. Every day you have to make that choice. And if you believe that you are where you're supposed to be, that this is where God has you for this time and purpose, doing what you're doing, then, I like what I think it was Charles Stanley when he said, if God tells you to run through a brick wall, you do it and trust him with the consequences. And so we're called to be obedient, and we leave everything else to him. And so, if there is a workaround where I'm not violating my conscience and I'm still able to do my job, then that's what I'm going to do, although it's going to be very difficult. If it comes to a time where I have to actually compromise my values and my beliefs in order to keep my job, that's when we have to have a different conversation. But nowhere does he promise that it's going to be easy. And so if you're not there, then you need to keep going until you get to that point.
Yeah. Well, and I hope that changes happen where that point gets staved off, because I really do, I really do want to avoid what would happen if there were no Christian adults in the public school system. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I do push back against because I've heard it for a long time now that the push is, well, everyone needs to pull their kids out, which I get that, because funding and enrollment are tied together. But I don't think or agree that there needs to be a mass exodus of Christian teachers from the school system.
Yeah.
Because even before this happened, you weren't standing in front of the classroom and preaching the gospel every day, but your testimony was lived by your actions. And so that's what we need to keep in mind. Like if we do not have a light in a dark place, then it's going to get dark very quickly.
Yeah, I find myself agreeing with you on that because usually what I hear is that same thing, but about the kids. And we've both said, I'm not buying that, right? But yeah, when it comes to the adults, it's like, I was talking to one guy who would be, and I have no doubt about this, that he was genuine about this, that he would be perfectly willing to take his family to Afghanistan if God said, I want you to go be a missionary there. But he was talking about getting out of the public school system, right? Because it was a lost cause. And I'm like, you would be willing to go to Afghanistan? Are you willing to go to work? Yeah. And it's that kind of thing. It's like, this is what it is to follow Christ, right? So I really appreciate you saying that and just that encouragement to stay in there because there's a need for the gospel. This is a post-Christian context that we're in, and that means that there's a lot of folks in some darkness. We've got the light.
Yeah, I mean, I hear parents tell me all the time, moms, I can't stay home with it. I just can't do that. Well, why? Like if you have the means and the ability to do it, I do think it's important that the husband and wife are the primary educators of their kids. So if you have the means to do it, do it. But not everyone has the means to do it. And so if you're a Christian educator wondering, do I stay in? Think about those kids. Not every family has the means to pull their kids out, and they need someone to be that influence.
I will say this for parents, though. A lot more people have the means than they think they do.
Yes. Because
a lot of people are maintaining a lifestyle that's less important than taking care of their kids. And it is time for sacrifices, Do you need that house and those cars and that many, there's the common list of stuff like how much money do you spend at Starbucks? And if you spent $4 a day on blah, 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 and, but it's all true, right? Would you be willing on principle to lower your standard of living one notch if your kids were going to turn out better? Or if they had a better chance at turning out better. Absolutely. Now, would you be willing to knock your standard of living in half for the sake of your children? Yeah. What psychotic parent would say no to that, right?
Yeah.
But we don't realize a lot of times that that's the choice that's actually in front of us. And so, maybe it's worth living in a house that you hate so that, because you just choose not to spend the money on, or not to be a dual income family or whatever, but you could actually pull it off so that mom is the primary, mom has more face time with the kids than anybody else. Kids become like who they hang out with the most, right? And it's like, I want my kids becoming like my wife. I think she's fantastic. I married her for a very good reason, and that is one of the best decisions I ever made. And so I want my kids to replicate that. I don't know who's getting a hold of them next year, but there are sacrifices involved, and I just want parents to start thinking in terms of, could I give that up? And the answer is yes, far more often than it's no. Now, there's a lot of single parent homes, and there's a lot of a lot of folks, like I know one family where the dad has been trying for a long time to get his citizenship, just got it. He went through all the legal processes and everything, but it's been a slugfest, right? Yeah. And putting food on the table is a real struggle, and there are legitimate issues there. But some of the issues are more fabricated, right? So parents, if your kids are in the public school system because you think you need two incomes, you might be right, and you might not be. And I'm just saying, give that a good consideration. And you guys pray through that and ask the Lord for wisdom, because if you ask for wisdom with faith that he'll give it to you, because he will, he gives to all liberally and without reproach. And he might surprise you on this, and he might require sacrifice. And you knew when you signed on to be a Christian that he had the right to call you to sacrifice. Ask yourself if it's time to do that for the betterment of your kids, because I do find many excuses that are not biblically grounded, right? But none of that's to take away from what you're saying, which is there are times where parents do not have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the work you're doing, man. And I appreciate your time hanging out with us and just kind of giving us the inside take on that. Is there anything that I didn't cover that we need to know? That average Joe citizen who's not first person informed on this stuff needs to know about the schools that we're supporting with our taxes?
No, I mean, other than to say, like, you need to be informed and don't be afraid to ask the questions. Like, ask your kids what's happening, what's being taught. Don't be afraid to reach out to the teachers and ask the same, and ask what's going on in the classroom. And asking the schools, how can I support? Because if there are extra eyes in the building, I mean, people are always more aware of what they're doing. They second guess what they say. They making sure. It's just important to be involved.
What do you think about the idea of making teachers wear body cams like our cops have to? Don't answer that. I'm completely joking. But more eyes in the classroom is a good thing. Yeah, and parents do have the ability. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but parents do have the ability to just show up at school and help and be put to work. I mean, I don't know if it's like show up same day, but they can call and say, hey, can I help with this or that? And they volunteer.
There's a process, and every district has a process, and schools have the flexibility to say, yes, we'll take you as a volunteer, or no.
Yeah.
And parents can't really contest that. Parents also typically have the right to come in. I do believe that law allows them to actually come in and visit. It's not like an everyday thing. But there's notice that has to be given. Like, they have the right to know what's going on in the schools. And so, like, a lot of districts will do the equivalent of like VIP days, where they open up schools for tours, so that the community can see this is what's happening in our buildings. So really just going to school board meetings, being involved, knowing what's going on, and jumping in whenever you can, and your voice will be heard.
It requires compassion in how we deal with these kids, because the kids who are confused about, we're discussing gender ideology and things like that, they're not the enemy, right?
No, our approach to them has to be completely different than we approach the system. You know, we can be a lot more stern and like just really in your face when it comes to the system and like protesting, because these are our kids and they're hurting our kids. But the kids, like you said, the kids aren't the enemy. So our approach to the kids has to be entirely different. We have to treat them with compassion, because there is a level of confusion. Their behavior is communicating a need. We have to identify that need.
You said behavior is a form of communication. Explain what that means.
So, I mean, you think about it for a second. Like when you have a newborn baby, that baby cries. You don't look at the baby and scream and yell at it. What the heck do you want? Like, you go through a list in your head. Does the baby need change? Do they need to be held? Do they need to be rocked? Do they need to be fed? Like, you go through this mental checklist and do whatever it takes to figure out the need so that this baby stops crying. It doesn't matter if they're a newborn baby or if they're a teenager in high school. Their behavior is communicating a need for identity, a need to belong, community, like we talked about before, community. What is it they're searching for?
Yeah.
We find the answer to that, and then we meet that need. We're going to see a change in that behavior.
And then in the end, also, we've got to come to terms with the fact that gender ideology issues, gender dysphoria, is a mental health issue.
Yes, it's a mental illness, and we've popularized it. And so, like, there was even a trans. Fox News did an article. There was a transgender professor who said, this is a mental illness. We have got to stop celebrating this. This is not something we should push children into. This is a mental illness. And they use their own life as a case study for this. This is not something that should be celebrated. This is not something to push onto our kids.
So then we can, whatever, in my words, rage against a system. But then when it comes to kids, then giving them community, it seems a little bit dangerous to me to take a normal approach where you put a bunch of people who are struggling with the same thing in a room and say, boom, here's your community. We do that with war veterans. We do that with, people who struggle with autism, or they have kids who struggle with autism or who have autism or whatever. That's kind of one of the ways that we get at this. Is like, all right, you're not the only one. Let's do this. But then there does wind up being this kind of confirmation loop where it's like, oh yeah, what I'm doing is normal, and I've been told that it's normal and this is okay. So you can't isolate them and you can't throw them with a bunch of others. So how do you show these kids love? How do you show them value and still speak truth into them? What's your approach to getting at this kind of stuff?
You have to see them as a person. You have to treat them that way. Not looking at what you don't what makes you uncomfortable or what you don't agree with, but actually getting to know them and getting to know their story. Every child has a story. And so it's our job to figure, especially in education, it's our job to figure out what is their story and help them to be able to tell it and fill in the pieces, fill in the gaps. And so really just getting to know the student. And I think it comes back down to mentorship as well, making sure that you're connecting them with appropriate resources and good people. To be able to do that. In
the biblical counseling world, we talk about, validating something and finding something to validate. Now, the trick is that we can't validate everything, because some stuff like, God just says no, or God says that's sin, or you need to warn them against that, not encourage them towards it or something like that, right? But to find something in there that you can validate, to form a connection, to say, look, you're a person and you matter, and this is a genuine thing that you're going through, right? And so what you're talking about, if I'm hearing you correctly, is they've got a story, they've got a struggle, they've got a hurt or a fear or something, and that's legitimate. Where they're taking it or being taught or encouraged to take it is not legitimate, but there is something in there about that person that you can affirm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think
affirmation becomes a dirty word, right? Because it has become like, oh, you got to be affirming, and that's code for. And it's not even code anymore. It's just like the new word for that is you celebrate people no matter what they're doing, even if it's destructive to them. And so we can't be affirming in that sense, but you can find something to affirm about them as a person.
Yeah, and we're confusing response out of fear as to responding in love. Like, I care about this person. Really, what we're doing is we're responding in fear, because it used to be. I mean, think about even the early church, even with church discipline. The whole purpose of church discipline was to bring about a form of reconciliation and repentance. Mm-hmm. Well, there wasn't a church. There wasn't 10 churches in the community for people to pick and choose from. Now you exercise church discipline. It doesn't lead to repentance. They just leave and go to another church.
Right, and badmouth you the whole way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so what we also see that what we have to be careful with kids is that we're saying there's this fear that if we stand up and call out what is wrong, that they're just going to they're going to go and find a community that is going to embrace them. Mm-hmm. And so our approach isn't the best approach, because really and truly, starting off, it's not calling out what is wrong, it's calling out what is right. And so, like you said, finding something that can be affirmed and building that foundation and starting to build that relationship. Discipleship is a process. Mentoring is a process. Yeah,
man, I can't get too specific about the situation, but I was interacting on a repeated basis for a certain sports season, okay? And I was interacting with a young kid who was, he was a boy, but he was dressing like a girl. He was painting his nails. He was wearing girls' T-shirts and things like that. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh man, what's up? And I'm looking at his parents like, are you guys awake? Like, who do I need to smack around here? So I'm feeling defensive of this kid, right? And I found just in praying about him and how to, talk to him and talk to the parents and praying for wisdom on all this, one of the things that the Lord kind of put his finger on was, when you see this kid, you're seeing a cultural problem that you want to fix, but that's not the kid's fault. That's not the kid's problem. And so you can't treat this kid as though he is the cultural problem. He's an individual. Forget about society for a second. You're not going to save society with your one interaction with this kid. Go take care of the kid. Right.
And a lot of parents respond the way they do because they're afraid. If they don't affirm their child, they're going to lose their child.
Yep.
And when you have a society saying that it's child abuse not to affirm your child, what options are parents left with?
Yeah. Well, there was a parent who had a conversation with his kid, a parent that I know, and his kid said, hey, I'm gay. And so he's like, all right, now I got a kid with same-sex attraction. We're a Christian family. How are we going to respond to this, right? And one of the things that was said in that exchange was the kid said, you hate me. And the dad was like, I absolutely do not hate you. I would give my life for you this moment. Like, I love you. It's like, well, then affirm, celebrate, be an ally. And he's like, I can't do that. And the kid was like, then you hate me. And the dad's definition of love was the same as the kid's definition of hate. Right. And so the words weren't being used in the same way. Yeah. And so the dad felt like he was at some kind of impasse here. And what he ended up doing, which I thought was masterful, in that situation, he went directly to affirmation. He was like, let me tell you what I actually see when I look at you, and he affirmed all of these image of God things and these skills and these talents and these passions that this kid had, and none of it was negative, and it was this huge mountain of affirmation, but he never affirmed the sin. Yeah. He never affirmed the thing that was broken and all of that. And I just thought that was so skillful. But that's a good example of what you're talking about, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, even my wife and I, we had a conversation about our daughter just this week who said, had an argument with her mom. This is how I feel. My wife's like, well, that's how you feel, but is it true? Mm-hmm. No. Well, if they don't align, if your feelings don't match the truth, you change your feelings, you change your mindset. We do that with everything else, but we don't do it with this. Mm-hmm. And that's the scary part. If someone is dealing with an eating disorder and they see themselves one way, it's not the reality, but that's how they see themselves. You have to change your way of thinking so that your thinking matches reality. We do that for every other type of mental illness. Mm-hmm. We don't do it for this.
Well, thank you again, man. I really appreciate it, and I almost just said your name, so I better cut this off before I do that. Guys, listen, Jesus deserves disciples. Go be one.
Hungry for Wisdom is a ministry of Grace and Truth Community in West Richland, Washington. You can find out more about us on our app, social media, or at graceandtruthcommunity.com. We love Him because He first loved us.